I'm Sean Fennessey, and this is Chris Ryan, and we are here to talk about Quentin Tarantino's 9th feature film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's a fantasia of sorts. Some of the characters we see in this film seem very real, some seem very fake. We are going to describe to you who is real and who is fake. Let's start with the lead character of the movie. His name is Rick Dalton.
Yeah, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and he is the star, the fading star of a TV show from the 1960s called Bounty Law, right? So he is essentially, to put it in modern terms, kind of a George Clooney figure, but what if George Clooney went wrong? So I guess he's David Caruso. Essentially what happens is he's on a long-running Western show called Bounty Law, and he makes an effort to get into the movies. That goes terribly wrong. He's got some alcohol problems, and he's now trying to put back together his career by appearing as like a guest star on other Westerns, on other sort of genre procedural shows that are on network television.
And Dalton is a sliding doors figure. If things go right for him, he becomes Steve McQueen, or Warren Beatty, or even James Garner, who started in television and then made the transition.
Maybe even specifically Clint Eastwood, who did have the version of Rick Dalton's career that went as good as you could possibly have it, was on Gunsmoke, made spaghetti westerns, became one of the great directors of the last 50 years in Hollywood.
Instead, Tarantino has pointed to a number of different figures who are essentially B-movie/TV stars that we've largely completely forgotten about. That includes George Maharis, Ed Burns, Tab Hunter. There's this vast history of Hollywood leading men who in their time seemed very important and no doubt had a house in the Hollywood Hills and were very successful and beloved by their audiences on TV every week, but have no legacy whatsoever. What do you think about Tarantino spotlighting somebody who never quite got there?
Yeah, I think those are the people that were important to him growing up. This movie is essentially a love letter to the culture of his youth and the city of his youth when he was a child growing up in Los Angeles. And I think that these kinds of LA citizens, which is what Dalton calls himself because he has a home, he owns property in Los Angeles, which makes him a citizen, are the people that fascinate him as much as a Clint Eastwood, as much as a Marlon Brando or a James Dean. I think it was interesting in this movie, there's a moment where Dalton is guest starring on a new show called Lancer, and the star of Lancer is played by Timothy Olyphant, who plays a cowboy. Timothy Olyphant notably has played cowboys before on Justified and on Deadwood. And Olyphant's character goes up to Rick Dalton and says, "I heard you were up for The Great Escape. I heard that there was a chance you were gonna get it. What happened?" And Dalton tells a story about the casting process and how even if Steve McQueen hadn't taken The Great Escape, the other Georges were up for it. And he's referring to George Peppard and George Maharis, or like a bunch of these other actors. It's almost the 1960s version of the Chris Wars, you know? But I think that there was so much competition. There's so many actors. You can probably be thinking, if you're watching at home, of someone you're like, oh yeah, that guy was in the movies before. And what happened to him? What happened to this guy who did one TV show and 2 movies and then just kind of faded away? And those are the people that fascinate Tarantino.
And the other thing too about Rick Dalton is he is the star of a TV show called Bounty Law, which is not a real show.
Yes.
And he appears on a show called Lancer, which is a real show.
You can watch Lancer on YouTube. Yeah.
Please Google that right now. There's this whole mystery around what TV show is actually happening. The FBI TV show that he makes a guest appearance on is real, but then other shows that he talks about are fake. What do you make of just designing a whole world where we can't quite tell what is real and what is fake?
Yeah, I think it's supposed to basically ask us to let go of that kind of stuff. We do a lot of fact-checking of movies and whether or not they're precise representations. This is Tarantino's universe. And if he likes something from the real world and wants to bring it into his world and pay tribute to it, he will. If there's a reason why he wants to cut together a montage of his own spaghetti westerns and Italian crime and espionage movies that he wants to make up, he can do that. Some of them have the names of movies that were actually released. Some of them have movies that he made up. But I think it's his realer than real universe. It's his playpen and he gets to make the rules.
Let's talk about Cliff Booth. Cliff Booth is a double. He is literally Rick Dalton's double in the movie, and he is played by Brad Pitt. Brad Pitt is one of the most famous movie stars of all time.
Yes.
And there is something winking about saying this guy isn't actually the star of this movie. It isn't really the star of this life. What did you make of Cliff Booth, and did he remind you of anybody kind of in the history of movies?
Yeah, well, Cliff Booth is interesting because he is sort of the sin eater. He's the one who has to take on all the physical punishment that action stars like Rick Dalton would have taken, especially in the 1950s and 60s in Hollywood, where it was very practical, effects-driven. So there's even a moment in the movie where Kurt Russell, who plays a stunt coordinator, Leonardo DiCaprio's character Rick Dalton is trying to talk him into hiring Cliff Booth, and he says, "Look, you can hit him with a car, you can throw him off a building, you can do anything."
Hey, you could do anything you want to him. Throw him off a building, right? Light him on fire. Hit him with a Lincoln, right? Get creative. Do whatever you want. He's just happy for the opportunity.
And that is the kind of, I think, the way they set that character up, that he's going to absorb the punishment of this movie. As far as like his relationship to the real world and who he could have been, I think you had a really good idea about this maybe being Tom Laughlin.
Yeah, so there's this film series from the 70s called Billy Jack, which is a kind of action-adventure series of movies, and Tarantino and Pitt have both told this story. Tarantino had a very clear vision of the kind of archetype he was imagining when he was writing Cliff Booth. Brad Pitt had this very clear idea of the kind of archetype he was imagining when he was reading the character of Cliff Booth. They both landed on Laughlin and Billy Jack. Is that director-actor bullshit? Maybe.
Yeah.
But maybe they are so creatively aligned that this actor, who wasn't a stuntman per se, but had the kind of affect, the kind of calm, cool, a ruggedness, a kind of like, I'm the toughest guy in the room, but I don't have to say so attitude,
right,
that he's really bringing to this movie.
Is Billy Jack like the old version of like the Transporter or the...
It's a little
like,
John Wick.
It's a
little John Wick.
Okay.
And less guns, more punching, more cowboy hats. Not as many feral dogs.
Yeah.
But it's John Wickish.
It's basically a one-man entourage. He's Rick Dalton's driver. He's his handyman. He's basically his hired friend. They hang out all the time. He wakes him up. He puts him to bed. It's a really interesting dynamic because there is this sort of power shift that goes on between the two of them where there's a feeling like Cliff is the person Rick pretends to be. Rick's very vulnerable, very sensitive, very insecure, like a lot of actors are. And Cliff is really this man's man, and this like he's the one who can pull the K-turn in a tight driveway, and he's the one who can jump off of a wagon that's moving alongside a team of horses. So the real and the fake, which comes up a lot in this movie, comes up especially in their relationship.
There's one other person who Cliff potentially could be if things had gone right for him the way that they almost went right for Rick, and that's Hal Needham, who is a movie director and who for a long time was Burt Reynolds' stuntman, who is another one of these Rick Dalton-esque figures who things went right for. And Hal Needham doubled for him for many years, became a creative collaborator, and then eventually, ultimately, became a movie director. And he became the director of Smokey and the Bandit, among other hits. Famously gave his body over to Burt Reynolds' career in many ways, but became a hugely successful figure. You could see a world where if Rick and Cliff played their cards just a little bit differently, they would have had a Smokey Bandit of their own, but they don't.
Who knows? Maybe after the end of the movie, they get that opportunity.
One person who we know is real in this movie is Sharon Tate. She has been one of the most hotly debated figures to appear in this movie. She, of course, was famously tragically killed by the Manson family in 1969. In this movie, we see an interesting version of Tate, who was an actress who was married to Roman Polanski, pregnant at the time of her murder, but had been the star of movies like Valley of the Dolls, Fearless Vampire Killers. She had been developing a reputation as a starlet, essentially, a young woman who had a big career in front of her in Hollywood. What did you make of the way that Margot Robbie portrays her and the way that Tarantino sees her? Yeah,
well, the depiction of Tate and her fate will probably be the most controversial element of this movie. And I think that it goes in line with a lot of Tarantino films. There's always something provocative about them. Personally, I felt like his treatment of Tate was ultimately out of the deepest possible respect. A lot of what we get to see from Sharon Tate, and people will talk about the fact that she doesn't really talk very much in this movie, but we get to see a lot of her day-to-day life. We get to see a lot of her walking around, getting some food, doing some shopping, going to the movies, going to see herself in the movies, reacting to seeing herself in the movies, interacting with her friends. And I think by doing that, he shows us the life behind the legend. She's become this sort of figurehead, this kind of cartoon figure almost about the Manson murders, about the horror that happened in the late 60s. And what we get to see here is kind of this loving depiction of the life behind that.
A regular human being.
Yeah, what did you think of it?
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. I mean, the idea of a movie star going in to watch themselves on screen, and she goes to watch herself in the movie The Wrecking Crew, which was this Dean Martin spy movie from 1968.
And that's a real movie.
It's a real movie. And it's a very fun movie. It's very kitschy. And the idea of her, reveling in the success that she has in front of her and just kind of generally enjoying what her life has become is very sweet and is not the sort of thing we think about when we think about an actor, especially not one who's so pitched in tragedy most of the time. So I agree with you. I think it's clearly a move of adoration.
And that moment where she goes and watches herself in The Wrecking Crew, I don't know if it's directly drawn from it, but Tarantino has a story he tells about taking a date to go see True Romance at that movie theater and asking if he could get in because he wrote it. And they're like basically questioning his identity. And they're like, can I see a driver's license or something? And he's like, but I wrote the movie. And then people start coming out because they see him Reservoir Dogs had come out already, and they start asking for his autograph. It's like kind of a nice life imitates art thing.
If you can point to your name on the poster, you should get in for free.
For sure.
Next, we're going to talk about Marvin Schwartz.
Schwartz!
Sorry, Marvin Schwartz, played by Al Pacino.
Yes.
Who is a fictionalized version of a producer.
Yeah.
But he is a producer who, if you are closely tracking Hollywood history, feels familiar to us. Tell us a little bit about the Schwartz archetype.
Yeah, so he seems to be a somewhat independent operator because he's essentially working out of Musso and Frank. And
famous Hollywood restaurant.
You know, has this great story about how he and his wife make a couple of cocktails and watch a bunch of Rick Dalton movies in their personal screening room.
Really, that's my dream.
It's
that
pretty
room
amazing.
that he has is my dream room.
Yeah, and he is essentially setting up a couple of spaghetti westerns for an Italian producer and is looking for American stars to go over and do that, which was a common thing in the 60s and the 70s, where you would have maybe fading, maybe guys who were still just wanted to work, like James Coburn, Bronson, I think, did a few.
Burt Reynolds.
Obviously, Burt Reynolds, Clint Eastwood. Went over to Italy, made these synced or dubbed westerns, which have in time grown kind of a cult following and a lot of people who think that they have like incredible artistic merit, which I'm among them. I think that those movies are really entertaining and they're hugely influential on a lot of Tarantino movies. And he's basically the fixer there. He's setting that up. Now, who do you think he could be in real life?
Well, there's two very notable Italian mover, shaker producer types. One of them, who got his start in spaghetti westerns and then eventually came to America and really became a major producer, is Dino De Laurentiis, who notoriously purchased the rights to the Thomas Harris Hannibal Lecter book series, has produced some of the best movies of the 20th century and some of the worst.
Yeah.
Fascinating figure. And then the other is Alberto Grimaldi, who has a little bit more of a stronger reputation as a filmmaker's producer. And I feel like even though Schwartz is clearly basically just a Jewish producer living in Hollywood, the way that many producers from that time were, he has assumed a lot of the qualities of these classic spaghetti western guys, where they can see what America can do for Italian cinema.
Yes.
And that's such a key part of watching how some of the characters in this movie move.
Yeah, and you know, now we have a world in which a lot of the movies you go see in theaters are globally financed multinational productions between China, America, the Middle East, whatever wherever you get the money to make these movies. It's fascinating to think back of the Italian-American partnership that was happening back then in the 60s in the global financing, and how those movies were different because of where they were being made and who was making them.
Chris, may the Schwartz be with you.
Oh, Spaceballs.
Charles Manson appears in this movie, and he was, in fact, a real person.
Definitely real.
Let's talk about two real-life figures that appear in this movie. One is an octogenarian named George Spahn, who's played by the great Bruce Dern. And the other is a young woman in the Manson family named Squeaky Fromme, played by Dakota Fanning. Now, Squeaky Fromme was, in fact, a real person. Who's the person that we meet in Quentin's movie?
She's essentially the den mother of Spahn Ranch. So Charles Manson, the Manson family, have set up camp at Spahn Ranch. When Cliff Booth meets them, a lot of them have decamped to Santa Barbara, but there's still a lot of young women hanging around the ranch. It belonged to a guy named George Spahn, and it was used for Westerns in the 50s, I think in the 40s as well. It was a famous set for Hollywood Westerns, and George Spahn just sort of oversaw the ranch. When we get to the ranch, for the most part, it's become like a crash pad for hippies, and Squeaky Fromme is sort of the sort of den mother of the entire endeavor.
Now, Squeaky, of course, later goes on to become a significant member of the family and all of the family's crimes. Mm-hmm. She is eventually jailed. Before she's jailed, she attempted to assassinate the President Gerald Ford in the 70s. She was paroled in 2009. Anyone curious to learn about the life of a longtime criminal in American history, please look into Squeaky Fromme. Otherwise, her life inside of this film is of a person who just seems very angry.
Yeah, and super into television.
Very into TV.
Very dedicated to making sure she watches her programs on Friday night.
That's very true. Anyone who has seen even just the trailer for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood knows Bruce Lee makes an appearance in this film, the famed martial artist and movie actor. Bruce Lee is an interesting object of obsession for Quentin Tarantino. Yeah. He's played by an actor named Mike Moe in this movie, and he gives an interesting performance. When we meet him, it's not quite in the Enter the Dragon halcyon days. We meet him when he's a TV actor.
Yeah.
And he's playing Kato, the sidekick to the Green Hornet, and he encounters Cliff Booth. How'd you feel about Quentin's vision of late 60s Bruce Lee relative to megastar 70s Bruce Lee.
He kind of seems like a blowhard.
Yeah, he's a dick.
He's holding court on this set and just talking about how he could kick Cassius Clay's ass.
Yeah.
And Cliff Booth fights him for fun, just not to mess each other's faces up, but just to see who knocks each other on their butts. It's a really Tarantino scene. It is his particular imagination at work of like, what if Bruce Lee was talking trash like this and someone there called him out? But I actually thought Mike Moe's performance was really vibrant and cool. And you see him again training Sharon Tate to work on the Wrecking Crew. It was like a nice little snapshot of how people in Los Angeles in the entertainment industry could maybe have outsized reputations before the general public know about them. But he hasn't quite broken through yet. What did you think of the character?
That scene in particular, the fight that you're talking about, feels like two trains that feel like they're on the same track and they're headed straight for each other. And on the one track, you've got Cliff Booth, old Hollywood stuntman. He's been around since the 1950s. He knows what this business is and he knows his way around a fight. And on the other, you have cocky, brash Bruce Lee.
Yeah.
And Cliff Booth gets his shots in. He gets some shots in, but it's just a small battle, and Bruce Lee is going to win the war. Bruce Lee is going to be the future of Hollywood, and Cliff, this is basically the end of Cliff here.
Yeah.
And there's something, even though Bruce Lee gets knocked on his butt, we know that Bruce Lee ultimately is going to stand tall. Steve McQueen is in this movie. The Steve McQueen. And yet he is not Steve McQueen, who is no longer alive. He is played by Damian Lewis. Your boy Axe, Axe Capital.
Yeah.
What did you make of Quentin Tarantino's vision of Steve McQueen in this movie?
He makes him into sort of this lovelorn guy left out. It's pretty amazing. I mean, he's essentially one of the biggest stars in the world in 1969, and would then go on to have this very famous romance with Ally McGraw, I think, throughout most of the early 70s, if he wasn't already with her.
He stole her from Bob Evans, the producer.
Yeah, and he is basically heartbroken over not being with Sharon Tate, which I don't even know if that's real or not. Do you know if that's?
I have no idea.
But yeah, he basically stands in as a figure of, even when you have the most success, you can still have something that's fundamentally wrong. You know,
he's a bit like Axe in that way.
Yeah, that's right.
The Manson family member that we spend the most time with is named Pussycat. She's played by Margaret Qualley, the actress from The Leftovers. This is not a real person, near as I can tell. Now, maybe she is an assemblage of people, but she is sort of the bait. She lures Cliff Booth into the family the way that many of the women in the Manson family lured people into the cult over time. What did you make of Pussycat?
Yeah, this is, maybe think of the character of the Swede's daughter in American Pastoral, which is a novel that's set in Newark over the course of about 20, 30 years in the middle of the century and takes in a lot of the unrest of the late 60s. But a lot of teenagers ran away from home in the late 60s. A lot got into drugs, a lot went out to get high and have the experience of the summer of love. A lot of people went to San Francisco and Los Angeles and went west. And to me, that's who Pussycat represented. Were these teenage runaways just kind of out on the road, growing up way too fast, doing way too many drugs, probably having way too much sex too early, and that kind of lost generation of people. So even though she's not someone who's drawn from historical fact, I thought she represented a lot of people.
There's a beautiful ode that is now posthumous, though we didn't know it at the time, to TV actor history in this movie. And it comes in the form of Luke Perry, who plays an actor named Wayne Maunder. Wayne Maunder was a real person. Luke Perry, of course, was a real person as well. He was the star of Beverly Hills 90210. He died earlier this year. Chris, what did you make of Quentin's decision to spotlight Luke Perry, somebody who we have a lot of associations with, in this role in this movie?
You've often pointed out one of Quentin's geniuses is his metatextual ability to comment on contemporary pop culture with his own pop culture that he's making. I mean, most famously did that with Travolta dancing in Pulp Fiction and reminded everybody of why they loved John Travolta. I thought that this was an unknowing, quite beautiful homage to Perry. There are a lot of actors out there who kind of get trapped in the roles that they're given, you know, and him as Dylan McKay, he never really got to outgrow that. He never got to do some of the acting that maybe he wanted to do, not to speak for him. And I thought that just having this brief moment of this guy up on screen was sort of a tribute to the Rick Daltons of today. The people who kind of, their careers go up and down, but you always kind of like them. You always kind of are rooting for them. And it was a fitting tribute to Perry, I thought.
One of the more interesting and slightly unknown figures in this story is Jay Sebring, who also, along with Sharon Tate, was one of the victims of the tragic murder that night in 1969. In this movie, though, we see Sebring as a partygoer, a close friend and confidant of Tate. He's played by Emile Hirsch in the movie, but he also has this rich Hollywood history, Sebring, what he did for people and how he kind of evoked a certain aspect of Hollywood without ever appearing on screen. What do you make of him?
Yeah, so he's famously one of the first serious male hairdressers. And I mean, he basically created the look of Jim Morrison, of Warren Beatty. He was responsible for a lot of the sort of post-hippie chic that we associate with late 60s Hollywood. Basically taking elements of underground culture and snazzing it up in an old Hollywood way. I thought he was like the perfect person. I mean, obviously he is historically related to the Manson murders. He's there, but I thought it was also really fascinating to see there were all these other people around that you don't know about. Not just because they weren't on screen didn't mean they had a huge role to play in the events that were happening in Hollywood at the time.
And he's kind of a signal of this, is it real or is it fake thing? Because we don't actually know truly what was between Sharon and Jay. We don't truly know what happened that night, what conversations they had, the things that they did. We know a little bit of information, but even though Jay Sebring was a real person, we don't know exactly what happened with him because we don't even have this on-screen evidence. And this is the closest we're going to get with Quentin's film. When Rick Dalton appears on Lancer, here to make his big appearance as the villain,
incredibly hungover.
the first person he encounters after the makeup artist that morning is Sam Wanamaker.
Yes.
Who is that?
So I was trying to figure this out. I think Sam Wanamaker is named after an American director who left Hollywood during the Red Scare, which is when a lot of artists in Hollywood and in New York were accused of being communists, essentially. And many of them had to either name their friends as fellow travelers or flee the country, and Wanamaker went to England. So that's the namesake, but I think the actual character is basically based on a guy named Robert Butler, who's a famous TV director who worked on all sorts of shows, Kung Fu, Hawaii Five-0, Columbo, Gunsmoke, and later went on to be really instrumental in like Hill Street Blues. And I just got the impression that he was supposed to be a lifer, man. Like, spends his days on TV sets just cranking them out, making stuff. And in a lot of ways, when the auteurs came in the 60s, a lot of the studio work that directors used to do that turned stuff over. Like Howard Hawks would be like, I'm making a Western on Monday, and the next Monday I'm making a romantic comedy. That fell to the TV directors. They were the ones who were moving through stuff like that.
Chris, your boy, Scoot McNairy, is in this movie. He plays a character named Business Bob Gilbert.
Yeah.
Who is that?
We don't know.
I have no idea.
This is one of those sort of strange joys. It's definitely going to require multiple rewatchings, but when you go see Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you're like, is that Lena Dunham? Is this happening? And this definitely happens with Scoot McNairy, where Scoot McNairy's just on the screen. He has like 3 lines. Clifton Collins is in the background. He's not talking at all. There's all these people that you're like, that's a movie star. I wonder whether that's supposed to make us feel the way we feel when we watch Law and Order. And you're just like, hey, is Jessica Chastain on Law and Order right now or something?
Yeah.
You know, it's like almost that sensation. But, you know, one of my favorite things in the lead up to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is just listening to Scoot McNairy sound completely shell-shocked about the fact that he got to be in a Quentin Tarantino movie.
Obviously, working with Quentin is like he is the show. You know, watching him hold court on set is the most entertaining thing I've probably ever experienced in this industry.
We've really gotten to the point where all these people who were raised on Quentin Tarantino movies now have the chance to be in them, and they're just like, I can't believe the life is real.
And we know that every actor that got involved knows that they could end up on the cutting room floor.
Absolutely,
In
yeah.
this movie, there are a handful of people. It was recently announced that James Marsden was cast as a young Burt Reynolds. He got cut. Tim Roth, longtime Tarantino player, who's appeared in many of his films, is on the cutting room floor, despite the fact that he appears in the credits of this movie.
Yeah.
There's a series of people, so I'm sure Scoot knew
There's a chance.
I could have been on the floor,
Yeah.
but instead I'm on screen.
Yeah.
When we visit Spawn Ranch, we meet this massive Manson family. Some people have lines, some people don't, but we do see a lot of familiar faces. And Quentin has done something very interesting here by casting the famous children of people that we know very well. Among them, we see Maya Hawke, who is, of course, the daughter of Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman, longtime
Yes,
collaborator
the bride,
of Quentin
yeah.
Tarantino. We meet Rumer Willis, who is, of course, the daughter of Bruce Willis and Demi Moore.
Yes.
We meet Harley Quinn Smith, who is the daughter of Kevin Smith,
Yeah.
the director, Sundance emergent director, along with Quentin
Exactly,
Tarantino in the early
contemporaries, yeah.
90s. We already talked about Margaret Qualley, who is, of course, the daughter of Andy McDowell. What do you make of Tarantino playing with how he casts all of these people that we have dark associations with?
Well, I do know that a lot of the people who wound up running away and turning against society in the late 60s, the teenagers, did so despite coming from like affluent families. So I think that there's a little bit of commentary going on there. I also think that Hollywood is a legacy town, and it still is. So when you see people like Tarantino and DiCaprio are lifers here. So I'm sure that they've grown up knowing someone who was, my dad does this, my mother works at this studio, my father is an actor, my mother is an actress. So I think that's the kind of thing that's pretty common here, you know?
Let's talk about the wives in this movie.
Let's.
Rick and Cliff both have wives. They both are put in extremely upsetting situations.
Yeah.
One of them survives, and one of them does not.
Yeah.
One of them is played by Rebecca Gayheart.
Another 90210 alum, right?
Yes, in fact, her character dated Dylan McKay, Luke Perry's character.
Holy shit.
And what happens to her in this film?
Does Tarantino love 90210, you think?
Bet your ass he does.
I was just really wanted to talk about the fact that I think it's worth noting that Rebecca Gayheart in this movie does not look like Angelina Jolie.
Yes.
And they are on a boat on the sea, and Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt famously before their breakup made a movie called By the Sea, which was about a couple breaking up. So I will just say that that was duly noted by myself, by yourself, by Amanda Dobbins, as being like, just maybe sticking it in a little bit there.
Turned the knife just a bit. The other wife is named Francesca Capucci.
Yeah.
She's played by Lorenza Izzo, who is an actress who was married to Eli Roth, Quentin Tarantino's longtime movie-making partner, and the Bear Jew from Inglourious Bastards. Francesca Capucci could be a couple of different people.
Yeah.
Now, you seem to think she might be Daniela Giordano.
It's just a wild guess. There's a lot of Claudia Cardinale-esque women in spaghetti westerns who tried to make a foray into American movies or television. I just like saying Daniela Giordano, just like Antonio Margaretti.
Yes.
Lorenzo Golami.
She struck me as the C version of Claudia Cardinale, who, of course, appeared in Once Upon a Time in the West and a number of spaghetti westerns, and then did make her way into American films. Lorenza Izzo is also put in the complex situation of having to survive one of the more intense attacks.
Helter-skelter, essentially,
yes. And these two women being put in peril like this, what do you make of Tarantino doing this once again?
He loves Final Girls. He loves having these kinds of like incredibly intense, Wes Craven-esque, blood-covered denouements.
There's a critical scene that takes place at the Playboy Mansion. That's where we meet Steve McQueen, as portrayed by Axe of Axe Capital. It's also where we meet a couple of other notable real-life people, among them Connie Stevens, Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, Cass Elliot of the Mamas and the Papas, and we see in full Austin Powers regalia, Roman Polanski.
An accurate photograph, because if you Google Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate, like that photo comes up pretty early in the Google image results. I think one of the most interesting things in the coming months is if this film gets into Oscar contention is reckoning with the Roman Polanski legacy of what happened after this, essentially, and everything that's come up in the last decade or so in terms of allegations against him.
Where was Polanski at this time in 1969?
He's in London. He's prepping a new movie. He had made Rosemary's Baby, and he was essentially the biggest filmmaker in the world. And there's this really great moment where early in the movie, Rick Dalton realizes that Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski are his next door neighbors. In the hills, what you have a lot of is people who own the homes and people who rent homes. And sometimes the people who are renting the homes can be far more wealthy or successful than the people who own them, but they're just using that home for the 6 months they'll be in LA shooting a movie or something like that. And Dalton sees this as this huge opportunity for him. If he can just get in front of Roman Polanski for a moment, everything could change for him.
Does everything change?
Yeah, and I think that's the ambiguous way the movie ends. It's like, does what happens that night, even if it's different from what we know, change the actual lives of people like Dalton? Thanks so much for watching me and Sean's guide to what's real and what's not real in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. We have so much Tarantino stuff on our website, on our podcast network, and on our YouTube channel. You can check out some great pieces from our Tarantino week by Adam Naiman, Kate Nibbs, Brian Phillips. Sean and I wrote something about great scenes in Tarantino's filmography. We've got some great podcasts. We've done some rewatchables episodes. Bill still won't let us do Pulp Fiction. Sean and I and Jason Concepcion did our top 5 Tarantino movies on an episode of Sean's podcast, The Big Picture. You can also watch a video version of that with a lot of built-out stuff in it. Thank you for watching us, and stay tuned for a ton more Tarantino stuff.